Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is my pleasure and my honor tonight to introduce you to the lecture of our distinguished guest, Sigrid Weigel. This lecture is part of a conference that is taking place at the Institute for Human Sciences at the moment under the title Hannah Arendt's Cryptotheological Legacy. This conference is funded by the Fritz Thyssen Stiftung. We are very grateful for this support. And it has started today and will continue into tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. We have had a nice start of it, and this is the keynote lecture for this conference. My name is Ludger Hagedorn. I'm a permanent fellow here to the Institute for Human Sciences, the IWM. And I would like to introduce you to Sigrid Weigel, the speaker of tonight. She was professor at the Department for Literary Studies at the University of Hamburg between 1984 and 1990. Hamburg also happens to be the place of her birth, so I think there is a special relationship to Hamburg in your biography. A bit later on, between 92 and 98, she worked as a professor at the Department for Germanistic at the University of Zurich. Between 89 and 2000, she was rector of the well-known Einstein Forum in Potsdam, close to Berlin. And in the early 2000s, or mid-2000s, she also became a regular visiting professor at several universities, and among them I would only like to mention Princeton University. And I'm not fully informed if that is still running or not. You gave up. Okay, thanks. However, what made Sigrid Weigel probably best known was her position as a director of the Research Center for Literature and Culture in Berlin, in the German context known as ZFL, a very famous institution in Berlin that she was a director of for many, many years. Sigrid Weigel is a member of Academia Europaea and the Modern Language Association, and if I did not miscount it, she holds 3 honorary doctorates at least. In 2016, she also received the Abi Warburg Prize, which is awarded for excellence in the humanities and social sciences. And the prize miraculously once again brings us back to Hamburg. As I said, there is a special relationship to Hamburg. Not only is it awarded in Hamburg, but it is named after the Hamburg-born art historian Abi Warburg. From her very, very many publications, I would just like to mention 2 very early ones and 2 late ones. With the early ones, I start a writing that was also a dissertation, published in '79, defended as a dissertation in 1977. The German title Flugschriftenliteratur 1848 in Berlin. So the translation would be something like pamphlet or leaflet literature, and her view at this as a popular literary genre. And note the year as well, the revolutionary year of 1848. The second early publication, once again the German title, Und selbst im Kerker frei, Schreiben im Gefängnis. So a book on the theory and in general on the genre of prison or jailhouse writing. And I have mentioned these 2 early publications by her because it already indicates, I think, a certain preference in her work, a certain enjoyment also for literature, as I would like to call it, literature on the edge or the boundaries of literature, and literature as an everyday phenomenon. Obviously, Sigrid Weigel has many, many other writings in regard to Hannah Arendt. I'd like to mention one, since this is the Hannah Arendt conference and the talk on Hannah Arendt today, a long article that she published in 2014, German title Buchstäblichkeit, Benjamins und Arendts Denken auf den Spuren der Sprache. So something like literalness, a word that probably doesn't exist in English. Literalness, Benjamin's and Arendt's thought following the traces of language. And most recently, or quite recently, a book on Die Grammatologie der Bilder, the grammatology of pictures. Sigrid Weigel's talk tonight is dedicated to Hannah Arendt's unwritten book on love. Traces and transitions to this unwritten book on love. Sigrid Weigel, we are very happy to have you here. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation and the possibility to my spectacle. I forgot. To talk on an idea that I was obsessed with since I read the Denktagebuch when it appeared in 2002. And therefore, when Raphael asked me whether I would like to participate in this conference, I saw it as a wonderful chance to come back to a thesis from an article I wrote long ago after the publication of the Denktagebuch. So in my lecture today, I want to elaborate the argument I made there about Arendt's unwritten book on love, which I suggested exists virtually or in a latent state, concealed within the entries of her Denktagebuch. Even though Arendt's œuvre commences in 1929 with the publication of her dissertation, The Concept of Love, in Augustin, Der Liebesbegriff by Augustin, on his concepts of love, not on love, a fact that the English title Love and St. Augustine obscures. And even though Arendt's entire work has, since young Breuil's biography for Love of the World from 1982, often been summarized under the title of Amor Mundi, or The Love for the World, Arendt never wrote a book on love. Or at least no book on love that examines its different states, including passion and the intimate relationship of lovers. And I will discuss this in... There are some mistakes in the numbers. It has changed, I don't know why, but you see it's five steps. By the transition has changed the numbers, I don't know why. So I start with first, this place of thinking and love. In speaking about an unwritten book, I'm referring to something different than the work that was never written, as Ronald Beiner describes the third part of Arendt's project on the life of the mind, with which she was occupied during the last years of her life. Composed as a three-part project consisting of thinking, willing, and judging, this book remained incomplete because of the heart attack that caused Arendt's death in 1975. Beiner's phrase, "the work that was never written," comes from his preface to the volume he composed, which was intended to replace the missing book with manuscripts of lectures that Arendt probably would have used as material for the book's production. Arendt did not live long enough to write judging, Beiner argues. And I quote, "Yet students of her thought would have ample justification for believing that, had it been written, it would have been her crowning achievement," unquote. As Beiner explains, he thus compiled the main available text by Arendt on this important topic, but found himself forced to admit that these texts can be, and I quote, "no substitute for the work that was never written." But the German edition titled Das Urteilen does in fact exactly present the volume as such a substitute. In calling this never-written book on judging Arendt's crowning achievement, Beiner obviously considers the life of the mind to be her ultimate work. And in this way, he forecloses any possibility that Arendt would have made further outstanding contributions as an author if life had given her more time for writing. In this respect, I disagree. In my view, there are several clues as to why it makes sense to speculate that Arendt might have turned her attention to an issue that she touched on in several of her publications and on which she reflected repeatedly without ever making it into a primary theme of a book. Throughout her published writings, the mode and state of love as patient seems to form the other side of the role of love for the vita socialis, the social life. Or to put it more precisely, the intimate love forms the other side of the vita socialis, even though it is at once the precondition for the vita socialis while also being excluded from social life and the public realm. Its state of concealment, Verborgenheit, in privacy might well be the reason why this kind of love marks a blind spot in Arendt's œuvre. In any case, her unwritten book on love is nothing like a substitute or replacement. Instead, it raises a number of questions, as for example, up what point and how advanced Arendt's thinking on love developed, and where and in what mode did its components surface in her publications? How close did the repeatedly discussed topic of love, in its various modes and appearances, come to being a book on love or a theory of love? And what place would the intimate or passionate relationship between two persons have in this book? Instead of searching for a substitute, I therefore will examine the respective traces in Arendt's writings. This way of approaching the issue requires that one focus on the moments where the question of love appears or where it begins to fade away. The reason for my assumption that Arendt might well have turned to writing a book on love after having finished The Life of the Mind is the fact that both thinking and loving occupy similar positions within Arendt's theory. What they share is that both are counterparts to the activities of vita activa. In an entry of the Denktagebuch, for example, Arendt states that they belong to each other in a negative aspect, because both flee the world. And here is the quotation: just as the lover flees with the beloved from the world of daily affairs to engage in the dialogue of love, the philosopher flees with himself, with the self discovered in Traumatsein, amazement, to engage in the dialogue of thinking. And since the Denktagebuch is mainly written in German, I give the original quotations and my own translation. And I come back to this later. It's very important that she started a Denktagebuch in German in the very moment when she appeared as a English-speaking author of political theory in the American market. So I think this moment is not without sense. But as we will see, this negative aspect also implies a creative potential, because thinking and loving remain in a dialectic relation to the vita activa, although each does so in a different manner. More than a decade after the publication of The Human Condition in 1958, in her last project, The Life of the Mind, which evolved out of lectures and seminars on thinking from the early 1970s, Arendt returned to the core of her anthropological political theory. This is her fundamental understanding of man as conditioned beings. As is well known, in The Human Condition, she analyzed the human activities that modify these conditions, because, and I quote, everything they, men, come in contact with turns immediately into a condition of their existence. And she concentrated on the three activities of Arbeit, labor for the reproduction of life, Herstellen, work in the sense of fabrication, and Handeln, acting between men, as indispensable modes of the vita activa. More than a decade later, she shifted her attention to the other side of the human condition, the vita contemplativa, in posing the question, in the first part of The Life of the Mind on thinking, of the way in which thinking concerns the character of men as conditioned beings. Echoing her book on Eichmann, in which she characterized him as being entirely thoughtless, she now develops the question of whether thinking may be considered as a condition that makes man abstain from evil doing, or even actually conditions him against it. Given this discussion of thinking as a kind of supplement to Arendt's theory of human condition, the absence of love and its role for the human condition in her work is all the more obvious. And I come to the next part, from the trace of love in the Denktagebuch to the human condition. The way in which Arendt elaborated the place of love and thinking in relation to the vita activa can be studied in a series of notes from the Denktagebuch that are obviously conceptual reflections for an emerging book. Here, Arendt worked up the composition and theoretical structure of her arguments, a structure that Tatjana Tömmel has rightly called a topology of the conditio humana. These entries belong to the period in which Arendt developed the ideas for the human condition after her book on totalitarianism was published. From among the 28 handwritten notebooks published as the Denktagebuch, comprising entries spanning 23 years, from June 1950 to June 1973, the major part, namely 20 notebooks, were written during the first 4 years. During these first years of her Denktagebuch, Arendt filled 5 to 6 notebooks a year. Thereafter, just one notebook a year, or later even one notebook every 2 years. The initial crucial idea of the human condition appears in October 1950. 4 months after Arendt started the Denktagebuch, in an entry on the concept of plurality. There Arendt discusses the various modes of mutual interdependence, aufeinander angewiesen sein. The entry starts by making a fundamental distinction between, first, the fact of plurality and inequality which determine politics and law, and the fact, second, that love needs love, that is, that no human being can exist alone, which she finds expressed in the existence of different sexes. Arendt then continues with an interesting distinction between the second, dem zweiten, singular, and the others, plural, in order to characterize the different kinds of human relations in these two realms. Here, in love, the one seeks or needs the second, and the third originates. In the case of plurality, conversely, the one must always already reckon with and rely upon others, not upon a second. And I think this is a brilliant differentiation between the second, zwischen verschiedenen anderen. Yet, it does not follow from this fundamental distinction between different types of human relations that the two realms are entirely separated. Love cannot be excluded from Arendt's approach to politics, the epistemology of which she explicitly distinguishes from philosophy and from what she calls the old Kantian questions, to develop, instead, an anthropological political theory. From this point of view, one has to struggle with questions brought up in an entry from January 1953, this time written in English. In this realm of plurality, which is the political realm, one has to ask all the old questions. What is love? What is friendship? What is solitude? What is acting, thinking, and so on? But not the one question of philosophy, who is man? Nor the was kann ich wissen, was darf ich hoffen, was soll ich tun? A number of entries in the Denktagebuch on the elementary activities of man and the elementary relations between them return again and again to the question of how love is related to the vita activa, reflecting both how love is connected to and how it differs from the three activities of Arbeit, Herstellen and Handeln. The first of this series appears in April 52, in an entry in which Arendt argues that the elementary relations between human beings are based not on necessity, Zwang, but on need, Bedürfen. Men find a way to relate to each other as persons because they need each other, love, and they live together as citizens because they must master Anankaya. In this context, Arendt emphasizes the genuine reciprocity of love. In several entries that follow, she examines the question by slightly shifting her viewpoint in each entry to illuminate the respective activities from different angles, varying the number of concepts involved between 3, 4, and 5. In December of the same year, and 3 notebooks later, we find a short entry on the political indications of the elementary activities, the active modes of being alive, of lebendig sein, as it were, that lists the same 4 activities, Arbeit, Herstellen, Handeln, Liebe, by referring to concepts of Greek philosophy, patein, suffering and loving, pratein, acting, poiesis, manufacturing, and ergazetai, laboring. Nearly 1 year and 7 notebooks later, in October 1953, another entry addresses these elementary activities as modifications of plurality and, in this light, extends the list to 5 components by adding thinking. Here Arendt shapes her crucial ideas on thinking and love by characterizing thinking as 2 in 1 and love as connected with worldlessness, Weltlosigkeit. Thinking, solitude, 2 in 1, conscience, the others in the likeness of myself, humankind, loving, togetherness, worldlessness in nature, life, emergence of the world. 4 months later, in February 54, Arendt shifts the viewpoint again and takes the perspective of the vita contemplativa, from where all forms of non-thinking activities become identical, and in this way shape the unity of the tripartite group Arbeit, Herstellen, Handeln. This triad is confirmed as a conceptual structure in an entry from May 54 that first mentions a book. In August 54, a longer entry shifts the viewpoint yet again by addressing efforts that lack any outcome, that are resultatlos. This entry argues that the effort of thinking and the consumptive labor to maintain life are without outcomes, since, as life itself, they are the human modes of being alive. In the last part of this entry, love comes into play, and Arendt summarizes. To labor, to think, to love are the 3 modes of mere life, out of which a world can never arise. They are therefore actually adverse to the world, anti-political. At first glance, this statement that a world can never arise out of love seems to contradict the entry from 4 months earlier, where love was equipped with the emergence of the world. Yet, a closer look, considering the changing viewpoints and perspectives, makes clear that the seemingly contradictory relation of love to the world concerns exactly the position of love at the threshold. That is, between love as mode of being alive, that produces no outcome, and the potential of love for the plurality of mankind. In the human condition, Arendt will find a beautiful way to describe this dialectic, and I will come up with this later. 2 entries in 55 finally conclude the conceptual carousel that represents a fascinating trace in Arendt's notebooks. 1, dating from May 55, begins with the difference between intimacy and privacy, to then oppose both of these modes of being opposed to the public sphere and to society. Here, the necessity of labor for the sake of maintaining life is ascribed to privacy, whereas intimacy is the realm of love and friendship. The public sphere is defined as the realm in which one may appear and present oneself in liberty, whereas society is the realm of being together as depending on each other in need, Bedürfnis. In July 55, the other entry, titled Amor Mundi, reformulates world as in between, namely as a space of time that emerges as soon as men exist in plurality, and as a realm where we appear as persons. We are recognizable only in the in-between, im Zwischen, of the world. The name adheres to us in the in-between. Within the absolute interior, im reinen Innen, there exists no name, only me and you, who can be mistaken for each other. With this entry, With this entry, the conceptual framework for the book The Human Condition, which appeared 3 years later in 58, seems complete. The first part, which elaborates the distinction between the private and the public realm, locates intimacy and love in the former, with the famous statement, love, in distinction from friendship, is killed or rather extinguished the moment it is displayed in public. And it discusses the historical alterations of the public realm, that is a site where we hear and see others and are seen and heard by others. The main part of the book shifts the viewpoint and concentrates on analyzing human activities. In the prologue, Arendt explains that her book deals with the most elementary articulations of the human condition and adds that the highest and perhaps purest activity to which men are capable, the activity of thinking, is left out of these present considerations, with the consequence that the human condition is systematically limited to labor, work, and acting in this book. The underlying theoretical reason for this exclusion is obvious. Since the in-between, as the site where persons appear and engage in exchange, an encounter, where men interact and communicate, and where the political originates, emerges from action in the public realm. Thinking, the mode of solitude, has no systematic place in the vita activa. In the belated supplement to this book, which I discussed earlier, which is the first part of the Life of the Mind on thinking, Arendt will argue that thinking nevertheless plays a crucial role for the human condition. But what about love? Love as a transitional concept in the human condition. In the human condition, love does actually appear in several places. But it does not have just one single place, and not a systematic place within the elementary relations between human beings. Love does not have just one guise, but alters its shape, character, and mode in different constellations. It is subject to transformations. Although love is not a central theme of the human condition, the book includes some dense reflections that illuminate love as a transitional concept, mediating between intimacy and the realm of human affairs, while itself is undergoing certain metamorphoses at the same time. And therefore it's not true that Arendt neglects the relevance of love and the private realm. Nor is it the case that her approach to intimate love means love falls into an eternal wordlessness, which is a commonplace claimed by scholarship on Arendt. In the first part of the human condition, in the passage where Arendt speaks about the twilight that illuminates our private and intimate lives in the light of the public realm, she explicitly stresses that this does not mean that private concerns are generally irrelevant. On the contrary, she writes, we shall see that there are very relevant matters which can only survive in the private. That means that love can only survive when it is, and I quote, not used for political purposes such as the change or salvation of the world. Consequently, Arendt in fact characterizes intimate love as unworldly and anti-political. This does not mean that love does not contribute to human affairs, but this contribution follows an intricate movement rather than taking a direct path. This path can be described as a complicated dramaturgy in several steps, via first a withdrawal from the world within the constellation of intimate togetherness, then the appearance of the third, the child, who prepares the re-entry into the in-betweenness of plurality, and then the return to the world of interaction. This dialectical view of love is developed in a slightly concealed but very beautiful passage on love that appears within the 34th paragraph on the unpredictability and the power of promise at the very end of the 5th chapter on action in the human condition. Here one finds a dense theory of love as a threshold concept in the dialectic of intimacy and the human affairs. Following a discussion of the conviction that only love has the power to forgive, Arendt writes, and I read this long passage, love by reason of its passion destroys the in-between which relates us to and separates us from others. As long as its spell lasts, the only in-between that can insert itself between two lovers is the child, love's own product. The child, the in-between to which the lovers are now related and which they hold in common, is representative of the world in that it also separates them. It is an indication that they will insert a new world into the existing world. To the child, it is as though the lovers return to the world from which their love had expelled them. But this new worldliness, the possible result, and the only possible happy ending of a love affair is, in a sense, the end of love, which must either overcome the partners anew or be transformed into another mode of belonging together. And this end, this open end, or, either or, I want to stress, because I come to this either or back later. The way in which Arendt describes love as the interplay and counterplay between withdrawing from the world into intimacy and living in worldliness explains why love can have no unambiguous or fixed systematic place in human relations and activities. Rather, it occupies a position at the threshold between two areas of life. It is not only elementary for mediating and transitioning between these areas, it also changes its character according to the area and mode in which it takes shape. If these different forms of expressing love belong to the same concept, to the same word, we can observe with Sigmund Freud that the negligence of language in applying the word love is justified genetically. Dass die Nachlässigkeit der Sprache in der Anwendung des Wortes Liebe eine genetische Berechtigung findet, as Freud shows in Civilization and its Discontents from 1930. This justification lies in the connection of the different variants of love that emerge out of each other to shape different areas of life. In his book, sexuality, family, culture, ultimately leading, for Freud, to an opposition between love and culture. Love may appear in different light for Freud than it does to Arendt. But in their views of the place of love in relation to social life, they are not so far from each other. Contrary to Arendt's verdict against psychoanalysis, which she, one has to admit, never really studied. Yet, when discussing her critique of modern psychology, one has to be aware about the situation of the field, namely the predominant ego psychology that was actually being practiced in the United States during the 1950s. But the passage I cited from The Human Condition also makes clear that it is short-sighted to assume a dualistic concept of love in Arendt. Here the worldliness of the amor mundi, and there the worldlessness of love as passion. And in fact, we lose sight of the fundamental significance of love for the human condition, which lies precisely in its threshold position, when attempts are repeatedly made to reconstruct a catalogue of the different categories of love in Arendt's work. As we find most recently, for example, again, with Tömmel, who distinguishes, and I quote, 3 or even 4 different concepts of love in the Denktagebuch, namely, love as, first, worldless passion, second as eros, third as amor mundi, that is love for the world, and fourth as unconditional affirmation, in accordance with the Heideggerian reference to the Augustinian phrase, volo ut sis, I will that you be. Moreover, the entries in the Denktagebuch that illuminate love from various perspectives in its relation to the vita activa are in no way evidence of an indecisiveness, Unschlüssigkeit, in Arendt's conception of love, as for example Dieter Thome argues in reading these entries as a detour via passion that appears to have left hardly any traces in the final version of the vita activa. It is true that the passages about intimate love in the human condition are not particularly extensive, but that makes them all the more important. For as a precondition for the fact that lovers will insert a new world into the existing world, which is the first step to the return to the world, love makes possible the world of being together and interacting, even if it remains excluded as intimate love from exactly that world. Above all, these deliberations on love are the foundation for Arendt's concept of natality, a guiding notion of the human condition. And natality somehow is, one could say, the replacement of passionate love in the human condition. And to come back to our discussion before on what is given, and I come to this later on, it's interesting that Arendt states that love, passionate love, is not of human origin. The next, Denktagebuch, the space of transition from experience to theory. So my argument is that the love as a threshold concept needed another space that is a space of transition from experience to theory, and that she developed this space exactly in the Denktagebuch. Dankeschön. The thematization of love in the Denktagebuch goes far beyond the entries. However, that hint at the conception of the book, The Human Condition. Not least at all, for example, several long entries that are nearly essays in scope justify speaking about an unwritten book about love. They are like building blocks for a latent book. And these reflections differ from the more conceptual passages in as much as a different gesture of writing comes into play, which the Denktagebuch first made possible. For In beginning this diary in June 1950, Arendt opened up a new, unique space of thought. The 28 notebooks, providing the archival source material for the brilliant edition of the Denktagebuch by Ursula Lutz and Ingeborg Nordmann, are just one part of many additional notebooks that Arendt filled with writing during her whole lifetime, beginning in 1923 as a 17-year-old student at Gymnasium. It is true that the entries of the Denktagebuch differ significantly from her earlier notebooks. Yet neither of them has anything in common with a usual private diary, nor the earlier, not the Denktagebuch. Although the title Denktagebuch does not originate from the notebooks that Arendt left behind after her death, we have the testimony of Lotte Köhler, Arendt's close friend and the executor of her literary estate, that this was Arendt's phrase for her notes. This title perfectly characterizes the entries according to Arendt's understanding of thinking. In The Life of the Mind, for example, where she characterizes thinking especially in contrast to science and knowledge and knowing, the state of thinking is identified with being fully alive and described as an activity, and I quote, concerned with such concepts as justice, happiness, virtue, offered us by language itself as expressing the meaning of whatever happens in life and occurs to us while we are alive. The entries in Arendt's Denktagebuch actually provide a space for reflecting upon what happened in life and occurred to her, and to discuss it in the framework of fundamental concepts of human affairs, as justice and the like. In the sentence I just cited, what occurs to us reads as a literal circumscription of patein, a crucial Greek concept that recent theoretical discourse in German translations, that recent theoretical discourse in German translates as Widerfahrenes. Something that occurs to me, that happens to me, that encounters to us, in order to overcome the long-standing misreading of patein as something merely passive, as suffering. Its translation is suffering. When Arendt refers in the notebooks to patein, it is usually in the double sense of suffering and loving. The beginning of the Denktagebuch marks a clear caesura in how Hannah Arendt dealt with what she experienced in her life, what occurred to her in the sense of widerfahren. The texts of the earlier notebooks, pre-Denktagebuch, which clearly refer to her experiences, which they articulate in poems and prose texts rich with metaphors, were strictly separated from her work. There the person, here the author. In contrast to this coexistence of personal notes written in poetic language and the published work consisting of philosophical texts and political articles, the entries in the Denktagebuch create an intermediary transitional space connecting Arendt's experiences of her own life and of the history of her day to her work in developing concepts and Hegelian political theory. This break is located within a significant constellation of Arendt's personal life history and the history of her work. In 1950, she had spent almost a decade in American exile and was soon to become a naturalized US citizen. Her first book in English, the extensive study The Origins of Totalitarianism, had been completed and was in press. And Arendt had returned from her first trip to Europe after the war, which has lasted several months. On this journey, taken in the beast of Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Incorporated, She not only returned to Germany for the first time since emigrating in 1933, she also met Martin Heidegger again for the first time after more than 2 decades. In other words, she had more or less arrived in the United States, had managed to achieve a place in the Anglo-American public sphere as an author and political figure, and from this position was able to look back at the past and into the future. The caesura in the notebooks, in her mode of writing and in the notebooks, is embodied by a tiny little number right there, in the right corner up. A tiny little number that marks a significant positing and a great distance from the previous notebooks. In the middle of a notebook, with entries from that begin in 1942, the year after her arrival in the United States, Arendt places a 1 in the upper right corner of the right page, and beneath the date June 1950, writes a longer discourse without a title on injustice, guilt, forgiveness, and reconciliation, which you discussed earlier. And the entries before this break, which are usually only on the right side of the notebook, record impressions and mental states of a life in exile, and they thematize the uncertain place of exile by using familiar metaphors of being, Daseinsmetaphern, as Hans Blumenberg calls them, such as a bridge, a door, and the shore, and the like. After the break, the pages are consecutively written on and numbered, while both shorter and longer entries are often categorized by a topic or keyword, such as Ad Gesetz, Macht, Allmacht, Gott, Götter, and others. These notes form a working journal in which we can read how theoretical questions and work projects develop out of Arendt's experience of history and of her day. Reading the 3 different parts of Arendt's writings in parallel to each other, first her work, second her correspondence with friends, and third the Denktagebuch, makes it partly possible to reconstruct these historical contexts of experience. In the Denktagebuch itself, however, the distance from a personal diary is clearest in the fact that her notes record neither names nor occasions for the entries. One exception is death, for the names of familiar or beloved individuals only appear if there is to be a report of their death, in accordance with Arendt's conviction that people only become a part of history after they have died, because all life is private. But after death, it becomes part of history. The last part, fragments of Arendt's book on love. In opening up a new space for reflection, the Denktagebuch also opens the door to a new scene of experience, into which theoretical considerations about love, which are found in Arendt's work, do not enter. One could call this perhaps the interior space of relations of love and marriage. The separation of philosophy and poetic reflections on personal experiences in Arendt's early work is especially characteristic of the topic of love. For example, many of Arendt's poems from the time of her studies bear clear traces of her relationship with Martin Heidegger during the years 23 to 26, and of the abrupt way she ended it. Her dissertation on Augustin, by contrast, which discusses the significance of charity for the vita socialis, represents an aloof and nearly unapproachable engagement with Augustin's terminology. In the Denktagebuch, the drawing of a line between philosophy and experience is softened in a certain sense, and the boundary of purely theoretical reflection is breached. This is the case, above all, for the open ending of the passage from the human condition I cited above, which conceives of love as a transitional concept in the dialectic of intimacy and the world of coexistence. This open end, and I remind you, is expressed as an either-or. The end of love, which must either overcome the partners anew or transformed into another mode of belonging together. In order to speak about this either-or, it is necessary to enter the scene of intimacy and the private realm and to consider it from close up. For it is only through such a consideration that the various facets of love are completed in their metamorphosis. And the Denktagebuch contains a series of fragments that can serve exactly this purpose. This especially pertains to the somewhat longer entries that the headings join together into an essay structured by the autobiographical rhythm of a diary-like notes, a kind of serialized essay above love. In December 1950, it starts, the blue. This has also changed. This is the transformation between the systems. I apologize. So in December 1950, an entry of 2.5 printed pages on the topic of love and marriage, Liebe und Ehe. In May 53, around 2 printed pages with the heading Ad Liebe, on love. And in April 55, just a bit more than 1 printed page written in English on the topic Ad Patience. In the spaces between these deliberations, there are countless shorter entries on different aspects of love, such as, for example, the relationship between passion and feeling, between solitude and love, between pain and pleasure, or on pathos and passion, on love as an absolute, as the highest form of recognition, and on the different readings of Volo ut sis. The first entry on love and marriage begins with a remarkable claim. And I first read it in German. Liebe ist ein Ereignis, aus dem eine Geschichte oder ein Geschick werden kann. Love is an event out of which a history or a destiny can emerge. This event, Arendt argues, is consumed by the institution of marriage. And she continues, institutions that are based on events will persist only as long as these events have not been completely consumed, aufgezehrt. In the case of love, Arendt argues, this means that marriage as an institution has rendered love homeless and unprotected, heimat- und schutzlos. And as a consequence, men and women respond to this dilemma or protest against it in a different way. Women do so, Arendt argues, by, and I quote, transforming love, which is an event, into an emotion, ein Gefühl, which not only degrades love because it makes something divine into something human, but also degrades all emotions because they apparently cannot stand the fire of love against which they are measured. And men do so by rethinking love into friendship, indem sie Liebe in Freundschaft umdenken. Although no friendship, as Arendt argues, could bear what marriage demands, was einem die Ehe zumutet. The deliberations that follow unfold a complex dramaturgy in the tension between love, marriage, friendship, and loyalty, Treue, that upends the conventional understanding of these concepts. For example, Arendt assigns loyalty to friendship, not to marriage, while assuming the freedom of love, die Freiheit der Liebe, and understanding marriage as an institution created by the free decision, Entschluss, of two people. And by the way, in the last point, she comes close to Walter Benjamin's essay Goethe's Elective Affinities and his assessment that marriage comes about through a decision and not through a choice. Today, because we have access to the extensive papers that Arendt left behind, it is not difficult to decipher the context of experience that shines through in these entries. For example, it's obvious to associate the statement on love as being an event out of which a history or a destiny can emerge with Arendt's relationship to Heidegger. And not only because love is an event and the word Geschick clearly carries the signature of Heidegger's language and thought, but also because one of the poems that Heidegger addressed to Hannah Arendt in February 1950, after they met again in Freiburg, speaks of love as event. And also because some years later, at the end of 1957, Arendt, who wrote to Blumenfeld that Heidegger, in response to their re-encounter, enriched the German language with several beautiful poems, Arendt herself wrote a poem in her Denktagebuch that reads like an echo of the images and words from Heidegger's poems from 50, such as, for example, the tie of glances, das Band der Blicke, and the word Geschick, destiny. Arendt's poems that are scattered throughout the Denktagebuch appear like embedded particles reminiscent of the language found in the earlier notebooks, because they more clearly express the author's state of mind. It is striking that the word heart wanders this way and that among the fragments on the topic of love and the poems within the Denktagebuch. Here, the never-ending repertoire of poetic metaphors of the heart, and there, reflections such as the thought that love takes possession of the heart, but it does not originate from the heart. And this position of the heart is in turn occasion for several entries about metaphors of the heart and the interplay between language and the feelings of the soul. And these are really brilliant, brilliant entries where she reflects about the coincidence between a metaphor that you only can understand when you suddenly have the feeling, the bodily feeling that it expresses. But let us return to the entry on love and marriage. With Arendt's reference to the freedom of love, marriage and loyalty, it also seems appropriate to think of Arendt's marriage with Heinrich Blücher. And in this case, the commentary to the edition, which is otherwise agreeably restrained in providing biographical interpretation, and I appreciate this a lot, refers to exactly such personal relationships. Among other things, it mentions Arendt's re-encounter with Heidegger and the fact that this included getting to know him as a married man with Elfriede Heidegger, as well as a crisis in Arendt's own marriage because of an affair of Blücher's. However, I'm not interested in identifying these kinds of events as biographical background, but rather in the fact that Arendt's Denktagebuch bridges the distance between the space of experience and thought in as much as experiences and observations evolve and transform into the conceptual work she is undertaking. And in this way, the Denktagebuch illuminates the metamorphosis of love within a web of single aspects. Countless entries take up individual strands from the first, highly compressed entry and explore them in ways that are more intense and differentiated. For example, the degeneration of patient to emotions is explained in the entry from February 51 in several ways. Because, for example, she argues we cannot stand the pure state of being seized by passion, pathos, or because of desperation about an end, or rather a suspension of passion, that Arendt also connects to a lack of trust. In September 52, one entry argues that love has no subject. It is absolute passion and at the same time the only true passion because, she writes, all other so-called passions are desires, Begierden. In the longer entry under the heading Ad Liebe from May 53, she finally distinguishes love categorically from emotion. Love is not an emotion, but a power, she argues. To then continue with considerations that lead to the conception of love as wordlessness. As the power of life, love for Arendt is not actually of human origin. And I quote, "It burns, pierces, like a bolt of lightning, what is in between, what is the world space between humans. And love consumes, namely it consumes the world and gives a hint of what a wordless human might be." From this, Arendt concludes 3 principles of love. It is, first, the power of life, second, the world-destroying principle, and third, the creative principle that goes beyond the state of merely being alive, because a new world emerges from its worldlessness. Arendt thereby formulates the basic idea for the place that love as passion will occupy in the human condition. Numerous entries on love will follow, though only up to the year 1955, apparently because the conception of a book has now taken shape and Arendt's work shifts to the manuscript. With recourse to Freud's argument that there is a genetic connection between the different meanings of the word love, I can summarize by saying that Arendt's Denktagebuch makes this connection visible in 2 ways. On the one hand, in relation to the genesis of her theory of love, and on the other, in relation to the connection of the various facets and modes of love. Only after more than a decade, and this is my coda, in 1966, does the Denktagebuch again have several entries on the topic of love. So there's more than a decade in between where nothing happens with love. This is the year in which Arendt was occupied with the English translation of her dissertation of the concept of love in Augustin. On January 16 in 1966, she writes to Jaspers, "I'm rewriting Augustin in English and not in Latin, and in a way that can be understood by a person who has not learned philosophical stenography. It's strange. It's been so long, on the one hand, but on the other hand, I still recognize myself to a certain extent. I know exactly what I wanted to say and can even read Latin fluently as far as Augustin is concerned." Although Arendt did not complete her revision of the draft of the translation prepared by Ashton, it is clear that Augustin and the question of her dissertation gained renewed intimateness to her and importance for her work. For one finds entries on the topic of charity and self-love, a trace leading to the project The Life of the Mind. The second part of this project on willing contains several passages that refer to Augustine, especially on the transformation of will in love, on the love of justice, and on love as the soul's gravity. It is in this context that Arendt also returns to the sentence, "I will that you be," volo ut sis, the phrase in Augustine that Heidegger made into a leitmotif and that Arendt understands as unconditional recognition, rewriting it in the Denktagebuch as "the highest form of recognition is love, volo ut sis." So my conclusion, why then, after completing her work on judging, as a conclusion of the life of the mind, would Arendt not have taken up writing a book about love?
So,
may I come down now?
Thank you for this. Sorry?
May I come down now?
No, stay up there. I think
I feel more comfortable.
I can join up there. If
okay,
you
on the same level. That's nice.
Okay. So, thank you for this lecture, and thank you for, as I would like to say, for this excursion. It was an excursion also into the philosophical Werkstatt of Hannah Arendt, and whoever has read her Denktagebuch knows that it is really very much an invitation to do so, because it's very fascinating, and you very nicely follow how these ideas arise in her work, and how they show up, how they come back, how they relate to what is published later on. So, and I think this was really very, very nicely done in your presentation. You also gave us an idea of what the Denktagebuch is about in general, what it consists of, and so on. That was very nice. What I liked especially in the beginning was your paralleling of the two activities of thinking and loving, your paralleling, following Hannah Arendt's paralleling of these two activities, both of them worldless activities, or even activities that are hostile to the world, as she says at one point. Both activities that seem to be so very, or are so very different from the political realm. And I would like to start just with a question as an opener. I mean, I will hand it over to all of you. Will have the room and the time to have your own comments and questions. Just as a starter, after this long journey, excursion into the topic of love in Hannah Arendt, I still wonder, how does this connect up to Hannah Arendt, the political thinker? I mean, obviously, I don't say that you have not given us any hints for that, but nevertheless, I still find it, this is also an open question, a question to myself. We have the political thinker on the one hand, and we seem to have somebody who also or occasionally starts thinking about love. Where is the big bridge? For example, if I think in political categories, one could think of something like solidarity or so. That could be easily linked up to a concept such as love. Is there something like that in Hannah Arendt, where she really tries to bridge these two like big chapters of her thinking? Hannah Arendt, the thinker of love, and Hannah Arendt, the political thinker. And how would you motivate this in her?
Mm-hmm. I would answer that she does not bridge it, but that's why I developed the idea of a dialectic between intimacy and the political realm or the public realm. She is a dialectical thinker, and dialectic means that the emergence of something needs something given. Precondition. And in the human condition, natality occupies this place. So the possibility of a new beginning. But natality also has a precondition. But this is concealed in the Verborgenheit of intimacy. And is exactly the place of love. So therefore what she says in the first part of the human condition, that there are things that are of urgent relevance for the human conditions and for the human affairs, but can't survive in the public realm. I would argue they are even more relevant for the public realm, because when the policy does not protect this realm, it somehow kills his own precondition. And that's exactly what takes place in totalitarianism. So therefore I did the detour on her supplement to the human condition in the volume on thinking, where she adds thinking to the human conditions, but not to the activities of the elementary activities, but as an activity relevant and crucial for man as conditioned being. And the same counts for love. So therefore, it's not a question of bridging. And I think there we are again in the misreading of Hannah Arendt, reading her political theory as a dualistic concept. Not at all. It's a dialectical concept, and that means protecting love and intimacy because of its relevance for the emergence of the in-betweenness, the world, and the space for in-betweenness and the emergence of the political. So therefore, she wrote her critique of the political rhetoric of the students' movement on violence. I think she could have done the same on the rhetorics of feminism, and one of her, I would say, mental relatives, Ingeborg Bachmann, did, with the same arguments. She had exactly the same idea, and when, for example, in her story, Three Paths to the Lake, Drei Wege zum See, she discusses political statements that occupy manifestations that somehow belong to mere living, to intimacy and the like. And I think this is somehow, I mean, I'm myself part of the generation that started with political feminism, and one of the rhetorics, one of the formula was the private is political, but we meant something different. It was a statement that it should be appreciated and valued and appreciated as a value. But when Arendt, for example, her idea of Arbeit, which is a difficult word for what she is talking about, but she explains why she takes this word, because one speaks on work of birth, for example. So the work of maintaining life is a very crucial precondition, but which has been separated from the political realm for the sake of both parts. I think this is very convincing, especially when, for us, because now we have all these experiences of what happens when love, education, privacy gets politicized. So during Nazi time there was no more family, there was no more private life, everything was politicized. The value of life, I mean the place where the value of life is appreciated is intimacy and privacy. And therefore it's so crucial and the precondition for the political realm.
I feel tempted to reply to that, but I don't do it now. So the floor is yours, please. Who wants to start? John, maybe. You look like... No.
still thinking.
If nobody, then I will say something.
Please.
I have maybe even 3 questions, at least 2. I have 2 or 3 questions.
Okay.
The first is, I had the impression that she did not, at least I couldn't discover it, study other concepts of love. We have at least 2,500 years, we have books and dialogues and whatever on love, starting with Plato's famous Symposium, then Stendhal with his crystallization idea is famous. Then we have, naturally, you have mentioned the word Freud with his libido. And then we have the sexual realm, Kinsey report, and what you have. Sexuality does not play a role as far as I have seen here. And that was not even mentioned. Maybe I'm wrong, you tell us. So my first question is that did she ever have the idea to study existing books on love? 2,500 years, there are libraries on love, and not one word on these books. So my second question is, I have the impression that this is all very unsystematic. Huh? Whenever she had a more or less logical idea on love, she noted it, quite fair. Huh? So she wanted probably later on study it and then come to a summary. So I mentioned only two, which are very different and which you showed. The first was love expels from the world, and it is due to the child that one is returning to the world, is one of the ideas which I could read here. So, what does it mean, love expels from the world? And if there is no child, one never returns to the world afterwards? What kind of curious idea? It's a sympathetic idea. As soon as I love, I'm expelled from the world. Naturally, one is living on the moon. Huh? Expelled. So, okay, that is, I only make it a bit plastic.
That was the two questions, right?
No. I said maybe three.
Maybe
the third
okay.
was, and now comes the third one. Another statement was, love is power. So,
Power,
as soon as you introduce the concept of power, then you immediately question what kind of power. Is it a democratic power or a totalitarian power? Hannah Arendt liked the word of totalitarian. What kind of power is love? Sometimes one says there's no power because when you are really loving, you are overpowered. But for her it is power. Is she then, with her power, when she is loving, exercise the power against the other, who probably will be more or less amused to feel this power of her, and so on. So these are my three questions.
She had not written a book on love. If she had written a book on love, I'm sure she would have gone to the library and studied a lot of books, but she's not a historian of concepts, but she does political theory. So her question is not how love changed and what kind of love, concepts of love circled around. There are many books about that. The book by Kuhn, for example, is a very educated one. But she was reflecting the role of love for human affairs, and that's a totally different questions. And yes, the Denktagebuch is exactly a space for unsystematic reflections. And therefore it's so creative, so productive. But if you read the thousands of pages, you see how from these experiences conceptual ideas emerge. Because she starts to transform and translate experiences into political concepts. Therefore, her theory is so human. Human. And therefore, we like her theory so much because it's based in human experience. that's why I appreciate her more than, I don't know, several philosophers. 100 years of philosophy, because it's based in experience, and perhaps this has something to do with the fact that she was a woman and exiled and a Jew and the like. The other, now we come to the statements. I translated it. Liebe ist eine Macht. Das heißt, it's not a power in the political sense. But Macht you can't control. Love expels you from the world. Excuse me, if you never experience both of these sentences, you are a very poor person. That's it. It's a poor experience. That intense love means there is nothing else than just you and me.
But one is returning only due to a child to the world.
No, that's not what she says, but that it's the only happy ending of love. That's what she says. Perhaps it's the only happy ending of love.
Return to the world.
And then, and it's the possibility to return to the world. Because the question is, when there is not this happy ending of love, what happens to love? The spell gets consumed in marriage and the like. So therefore, her emphasis on it's perhaps the only happy ending of love. And then she says, either love overcomes the partners again, so a renewal of desire and all of this, or it gets turned in another kind of togetherness. I think this is a very lovely description of what happens in time when two persons live together. So, I don't know, she describes experiences, and I find this very convincing.
Thank you very much. I guess I have three words that are trying to figure out, and would love you to see if they make any sense to you. So one is boundary. You talked about it as a dialectic experience, and her as a dialectical thinker, which I'm not sure I fully understand. But I guess one is the relation between a dialectic and a boundary. So that love is a boundary. That love is in the intimate sphere as a boundary to the public. What makes it dialectical as opposed to a boundary? The second part is that I was struck in listening to you in a really productive way about the relations between love and labor, love and life. And just like, I took a major thrust of your talk, which I really found interesting, is that love drives us in a way. It's a kind of life drive towards others, and that it, even though it's worldless, it can at some point create worldliness in another sense as a boundary. And it strikes me that that's also how she describes labor. Labor is what drives us to live, drives us to consume, drives us to do things. It gives us the energy to move forward at times. And so I just was wondering if you see a connection there between labor and love, the labor of love. And then the last part is that for her, labor has been victorious. I mean, the labor has sort of taken over the world of action and the vita activa. And I'm wondering why love hasn't, or has it? I mean, I'm just wondering, I'm really interested in this connection in labor and love, and if that's something you've thought about at all, and if that's something to pursue.
We should perhaps go back to the quotation, because I was emphasizing that one has to be aware under which question she discusses the relation between different concepts. And the relation between love and labor has to do with the question of result, of outcome. and where she says, these are conceptual reflections. It's not the theory, the complete theory, but reflections on certain aspects of the concept she will deal with in the human condition. And in this quotation, she reflects the relationship between labor and love as being mere life, because they have to do with life. And perhaps it has to do with what we discussed earlier as also as nature. Because the reproduction, the maintaining of life, the reproduction of life, that's what she calls labor. So I think it's a problem with the word, because we have the Labour Party and this is something totally different. No, it's what is done in the family, in the household, in order to maintain, to educate, to raise up children and the like. So this is mere life. There is nothing that, it's consuming all the time. So therefore there is no result. Whereas, and she differentiates this in these conceptual entries from herstellen, where there is something afterwards. And I think these conceptual entries are interesting in order to observe how the system of the human condition emerges, how she develops this, which are the questions she addresses. So the questions of elementary relations, elementary activities, the question of outcome, the question of vita activa and vita contemplativa, or all non-thinking activities. So she turns the relationship. Therefore, I talked on a carousel of the components for the human condition. She turns the viewpoint around all the time in order to illuminate all aspects of the relationship between these components. I found this very fascinating to see how her theory emerges. It does not mean that any sentence is written for eternity in Denktagebuch.
There was also Roger's first remark on love as a boundary phenomenon.
No, as a threshold. In the abstract, it's a threshold concept, mediating between intimacy and the in-betweenness, and plurality. Because, and I think not a boundary concept, but a threshold concept. And I talked on boundary when I said that the Denktagebuch, as a new space of thought, is a break of boundaries of mere theory, because she opens the door to experience. That was my reference to boundary.
Sigrid, thank you very much for your beautiful paper. My question will be on an expression which is very difficult to understand, which is amor mundi, because in all
amor mundi.
Amor mundi. Because first, I suppose that it is deliberately that you didn't talk about the very harsh judgment of Arendt about love in politics, and the way that in politics she prefers friendship to love, because there is something too close in the experience of love, whereas friendship is a relation between two people with distance. And on the love you talked about from the Denktagebuch is always a love between two persons, and even volo ut sis, I will, that you are. So it's between I and you, so two persons. But what does it mean? I mean, it is really a question I pose to myself. What kind of an object is the world when it is an object of love? Because love is, the world is the plurality. It is not, someone. Mm-hmm. So how do you understand this expression? Because as far as I remember, in the book on Augustin, it is not question of amor mundi, but dilectio mundi. And dilectio mundi in Augustin is something negative, because he always wants people to not to love the world, but to love God, let's say. Mm-hmm. Huh? And dilectio mundi is not amor mundi. So I think that amor mundi is not in the book, in the Augustin book.
No.
Okay.
I agree.
You agree. Well,
and she's very critical with Augustin.
That's
book.
what
Each chapter ends with there's no answer.
Of course.
There is a failure. She ends up with a failure of Augustin.
So my question is, how do you understand the expression amor mundi? What does it mean? For me, it is very difficult to understand.
I guess that the amor mundi concept is overestimated since Young Brühl's book. Okay. It's not, for me, it's not that important in Arendt. And in the Denktagebuch, there is one entry, amor mundi. Why it's so difficult to love the world?
Really? It's my question.
Yeah. So I don't think that that this was her program. Amor mundi. But she discusses the amor mundi as a concept, one of the love concepts, especially in the Christian tradition. But I think it's not her idea. Her idea of love and world, the relation of love and world, is much more complicated, as I tried to develop. And the fact that especially passionate love, in the this was my selection, because I wanted to argue that that this is not a blank page in her thinking. So she wrote in her published works on all kinds of love, but not so much on intimate love. And I wanted to argue this is not just a blank space, but there are reflections in the Denktagebuch, but there are also entries on other kinds, and other modes of love.
Can I give you my interpretation of amor mundi? Because I had an idea, I don't know if you agree. If I compare amor mundi with the correspondence with Scholem about love of the Jewish people, what she doesn't accept in this expression, love of the Jewish people, is that to love a people is to transform it in a one.
Yes.
I love the people, so it's the people as a whole, as one. And this is very dangerous, because it doesn't take into account the plurality within the people.
Yeah, that's the problem with the notion of folk or nation.
Yes. Whereas amor mundi, the world cannot be one. Mm-hmm. The world is necessarily a plurality. So you can love it because you are not in danger of uniting anything. So that's what the way I try to understand this.
Yeah, but I guess that amor mundi is not that important for Arendt as the reception takes it. But the amor in amor mundi is not the same as I love you. It's a different meaning of love, and it's a different concept of love. And therefore, those scholars who try to construct a catalog of different concepts of love focus on amor mundi as a different concept than passionate love. But I think that in human condition, Hannah Arendt somehow developed her own theory out of the observation and the fact that we need others. Das Bedürfnis for others. And she positions this in the public realm. So therefore, the amor mundi uses the same concept as Freud said. There is a genetically explanation for that, but it's a total different meaning, an entirely different meaning than passionate love.
So we will come to a close soon. I guess I think we have two more questions, remarks. Agatha, you first.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be very brief and follow upon your own remark. You mentioned the gratitude.
In?
The gratitude. You mentioned the gratitude, our former discussion about the gratitude, Dankbarkeit towards what is given. And I wanted to ask you, is gratitude, the way Arendt understands it, a form of love? And if so, perhaps this is a kind of a beginning of the conception of amor mundi as this different kind of love, which can also be understood in the light of her remark from November 1969, the highest form of recognition towards the given condition of my life, towards which I basically say, volo ut sis. It doesn't have to be personal. It means that I want you to be. I want all the conditioning of my birth to be the way it was, right? So the wonder of my birth that implies the affirmation of what is given. Could this kind of gratitude be the beginning of amor mundi?
Maybe we just collect and you have the second as well.
Yes, thank you very much for the lecture. This is just a Denktagebuch in my oral medium here. I was thinking when you said experience of love means that the world is destroyed, the influence of the world, or the world as something that is a magnet, you know,
as a space.
Yes, and then comes at the end of life, intimate details become part of the public sphere. These were two stations in your lecture, and this is, I think, have you ever thought that this is something that could have been changed in the last 15 years for all the teenagers and tweens, because experience of love destroys the world often means that people, because you fall in love, try to destroy it by Facebook. Yeah, and then you end of life, intimate details become part of they become even wrong details become part, because the envy machine is so much encouraged by this new media, and also to be, let's say, so the preconditions of non-totalitarian togetherness in society. I think it's a necessary, systematically necessary fight, and maybe whether you ever thought whether today's lectures, the contents that Arendt can give into the discussion could be helpful there for the new generation loving in digital worlds, which are not worlds.
We would need another evening to discuss this. But I mean, the main precondition is that the separation between intimacy or privacy and the public realm is no longer there because of the internet and social networks and the like. And therefore, the impact for the psychoanalytical impact for what Freud calls the psychic apparatus has not yet been analyzed. That's why I say the Freud for the web, for the area of the web is not yet there, but we really have to work about that. I'm convinced that the whole structure of the person and of subjectivity totally changes, and especially in respect of recognition. I mean, I will that you be as the absolute recognition has now turned into a constant, repeatedly and never-ending desire for acknowledgement and for being seen. So what took place in intimacy, recognition, and the fact that we appear to others, are heard by others and hear others in the public realm have totally intermingled, and therefore there is no more absolute recognition. I think we really have to think about that, take care, and but we will not be able to change it. We only can try to discuss and educate our kids and grandchildren how insane this is and how it destroys our idea of the person being based in desires, thinking and interacting with others, because this has nothing to do with interaction and communication. And I don't know, I haven't talked on gratitude in my lecture, but when we discussed earlier, I was thinking about two different questions of beginning. The beginning of law, where you are reference to the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition was very important, but the beginning of life has more to do with what John discussed, the given and the nature. And with love, there is one step back, I would say, to natality, in relation to natality. So natality is the topic in the human condition, but there is one, not thing, but one phenomenon behind, and that's the passionate love. And therefore she, in analogy to our discussion on law, she says it's not of human origin. So it's something that comes over us. But it's crucial for the emergence of new life. So therefore, I think it has nothing to, for me it has nothing to do with gratitude, but with the appreciation of the given and of the mere life, not in the Agamben sense, so, but being alive, what she calls lebendig sein. That is, her mere life is lebendig sein. And I think this is a very important idea.
Okay, thank you for the lebendig sein on stage here tonight. I think we have to come to an end here. Thanks to all of you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for taking part in the discussion. You're all invited now for a glass of wine and some cheese downstairs. Please join us. I think most of you know the place. Just follow the stairs downward, and please join us there. And I will obviously not end without saying, expressing my gratitude to you, Sigrid Weigel, for this wonderful talk. For this, as I called it, a journey into the adventures of thinking in Hannah Arendt. It was very nice and fascinating, and I would like to thank you very much for this and say that it was a pleasure to follow her traces with you and to see the transitions that you outlined to us. Thank you for that.
Thank you for the